I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Riane Eisler. She's founder and president of the Center for Partnership Studies, which is dedicated to research, education, and public policy work through programs such as the Caring Economy Campaign, which works to develop social wealth indicators that allow the financial value of investing in people and nature, and has a Caring Economy Coalition and Leadership Training Program. Another one of their programs is the Spiritual Alliance to Stop Intimate Violence, which Eisler co-founded with Nobel Peace Prize laureate Betty Williams. She's internationally known for her groundbreaking contributions as a systems scientist, attorney, working for the human rights of women and children, and she is the author of many books, including The Chalice and the Blade. So I would like to ask you to help welcome Riane Eisler, who is unable to travel to be with us, but she has agreed to be with us by Skype. Please welcome her.
Thank you. And can you hear me and can you see me?
Yes.
Yes, well, I wish I could see you. And even beyond that, I really wish I could be with you in person. But since that was not possible, I want to thank you, Darcia, for making it possible for me to, at least for a little while, be with you electronically. Now, as you know, I'm going to widen our lens of analysis, and we're going to look at the larger social context for family relations, and hence at the role of social context in shaping what children experience, observe, and learn, and with this, of course, whether or not they flourish. However, we are not going to look at a one-way process, but at an interactive one. In other words, we will also look at the role families as primary socialization agents play in shaping and maintaining the larger social system in which children and adults live. So we'll not be looking at the simple causes and effects, but at mutually supporting interactive systems dynamics, which has been, as those of you familiar with my work know, the approach of my multidisciplinary cross-cultural historical study of human societies. And in the short time that we have together, I am going to tell you a little about some of the findings from this study, including the new theoretical framework resulting from it to pave the way for a clearer understanding of social dynamics. Something that I should add, I am passionately committed to, not only through my research and my writing, but also because as a mother and a grandmother, I am deeply concerned, as so many of us are, about what kind of future our children will inherit. And that future will, of course, largely be determined by what kind of social systems we build. So I'm going to start with the obvious. Families do not spring up in isolation from their larger social, economic, and cultural context. As a primary means of socialization, indeed the primary means, families have to prepare children to function in this larger context. And this affects beliefs, behaviors, and as I will briefly develop, brain neurochemistry. I will then describe the new conceptual framework of the partnership system and the domination system as two underlying social configurations which transcend conventional categories, such as religious or secular, Eastern or Western, free industrial or industrial, rightist or leftist, and so on, and how, depending on the degree of orientation to either of these systems, families are very different, with different effects on children and adults. For instance, as you're aware, psychologists have long pointed to the scars from harsh childhoods, which as I will show, are typical of domination social contexts. More recently, neuroscientists have found that people who grow up in harsh families tend to have disrupted neurochemical patterns, for example, of serotonin and dopamine activity, leading to depression, irritability, and other severe functional problems. As you're also aware, some psychologists have proposed that the determining factor in how children develop is whether or not they had a secure bond with their mother. That is, of course, the very well-known attachment theory of psychoanalyst John Bowlby, who argued that babies have an instinctive need for attachment to their mothers, rooted in our ancient evolutionary heritage in gathering hunting societies, and therefore that daycare and other contemporary ways of child care go against our nature and are harmful to children. As you also know, other psychologists reject this view. They note that mothers are not the only adults with whom children bond, that in fact, in most of today's gathering hunting societies, babies and infants are frequently cared for by relatives, including older siblings, as well as other group members, and indeed that for much of human history, a variety of people, not just mothers, have taken care of babies and infants. And that what we actually see historically is not mono, but alloparenting. And I would add that the idea that child rearing has severely deteriorated in modern times is really hard to support if we look, as I have, at the historical evidence. For instance, biographical and autobiographical accounts of childhood as late as the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe indicate that even in middle and upper class families, maltreatment of children, including severe violence, was commonplace, as was the practice of outsourcing parenting to wet nurses and others. And of course, violence was also, I should add, a commonplace routine in schools. It is also well documented that in most farm families, mothers spent a huge amount of time on subsistence tasks, as well as cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, so that others, including older children, especially girls, took over much of the care of infants. And finally, pediatricians and other child experts today point to the very damaging effects of the so-called traditional or highly punitive and often violent child rearing that was common in earlier times. Now, none of this is to say that bonding with a caregiver is not important for child flourishing, but it is to say that other factors must be considered. To begin with, basic matters, such as lack of nutrition and health care, very adversely impact child flourishing. For example, both poverty and discrimination, and the two often go together, negatively affect child development, even survival. Discrimination, as we see all around us, can be based on factors such as race, religion, ethnicity, and gender, and indeed severe gender discrimination is the norm still today in some world regions such as Southeast Asia, where some preference leads to families giving not only less health care and education to girls, but less food. And this has many intergenerational effects, since even those girls who survive this discrimination are typically malnourished, so in turn their children are robbed of their full potentials. I should add matters I have extensively researched in my work on advancing the human rights of women and children. Now, these kinds of cultural factors can be and have been studied in terms of direct causes and effects. However, the role of culture in child development goes deeper and more systemic. For example, the level of stress of the caregiver or caregivers, whether caregiving is given adequate social, economic, and emotional support, whether family relations model equality or inequality, whether the cultural norm for parenting is harsh, violent, coercive, with attendant levels of stress, or more respectful, nonviolent, and caring, are among other key factors. So, for all these reasons, the culture or subculture into which children are born makes a big difference in how we developed. Moreover, what kind of people children grow into, in turn, directly affects their culture or subculture. As I said, in an interactive dynamics, we need to understand to promote both child flourishing and to build a better society. And of course, the two are inextricably interconnected. So, in the short time we have together, I want to focus on a key aspect of these interactive dynamics, the interaction between families and their larger social context in shaping beliefs, behaviors, relationships, and as I said, even brain neurochemistry. And I will start with the basic premise that families are formed by people who have learned what kinds of relations are considered normal and moral in their particular culture or subculture. Now, this does not mean that all families conform to a culture's family ideal. For instance, studies show that authoritarian and punitive families were the traditional norm in Nazi Germany. Yet, as Pearl and Samuel Olener found in their famous study of German helpers of Jews, the Germans who saved Jews from the Holocaust generally came from democratic and caring families, families that did not conform to the prevailing cultural norm. So what we're dealing with are cultural central tendencies in the culture. However, in every culture, a majority of families must conform to its family norm if the beliefs, behaviors, relationships, and social structures of the culture are to be maintained. So all this leads to a key question directly relevant to the theme of this symposium on child flourishing, the question of what kinds of cultures and subcultures promote or hinder optimal human development. Now, the first step towards answering this question is defining what we mean by optimal human development. And here I borrow the definition of optimal development or flourishing proposed by Gleason and Narves in Childhood Environments and Flourishing, where they write, and I quote, "Flourishing among adults has been defined by positive psychologists as living within an optimal range of human functioning, one that connotes goodness, generativity, growth, and resilience." And they add, and I again quote, "We explicitly expand the notion of flourishing to include an emphasis on the social moral aspects of development, such as strength in empathy and cooperation, and they emphasize the importance of, and I quote, considering how actions affect others, taking into account the well-being of others, and including the community when making decisions and selecting actions." End of quote. So with this definition in mind, we can narrow the question of how culture impacts human development by asking, and this is the question that has animated my research, by asking what kinds of cultures support the expression, on the one hand, of our human capacities for consciousness, caring, empathy, cooperation, and creativity, or alternately, because of course we also have these, our capacities for insensitivity, cruelty, exploitation, and destructiveness. Now, that takes us to a second step in answering that question. which has been central to my work. Redefining cultures from a perspective that recognizes the importance of how family relations are constructed in different kinds of cultural environments. And for this second step, I draw from the multidisciplinary cross-cultural historical research that led to the identification of the two new social categories I mentioned, domination systems and partnership systems, that, as I said, go beyond conventional classifications such as religious or secular, rightist or leftist, Eastern or Western, Northern or Southern, industrial or pre or post-industrial, and so on. But before I go on to this new conceptual framework for the study of society, I want to just say a few words about the method of inquiry that led to its development, the study of relational dynamics. And this is a method that focuses on two primary relational dynamics. The first is what kinds of relations, from intimate to international, a particular culture encourages or discourages. And the second is how various elements of a culture interactively relate to shape and maintain its basic character as a system. Now, to analyze these relationships, the study of relational dynamics draws from a much larger database than customary studies of how humans behave individually and in groups. In contrast to most studies, often accurately called, quote, the study of man, its database includes the whole of humanity, both its female and male halves. It also takes into account the whole of our history, including the thousands of years we call prehistory. And it looks at the whole of our lives, not only the so-called public sphere of politics and economics that are the focus of most studies of society, but where we all live. Yes, our private, family, and other intimate relations. And once we look at this larger picture, we can see patterns, configurations, or interactions among key elements of social systems that repeat themselves cross-culturally and historically. Since these configurations had not been identified before, the terms domination system and partnership system were coined to describe them. And I again want to reiterate that these configurations transcend familiar categories like religious or secular, leftist or rightist, Eastern or Western, Northern and Southern, industrial, etc. Because if you think about it, these conventional categories only describe particular aspects of a society, such as ideology, technology, geographical location, all of which is important information, but what it does not tell us anything about is how a society constructs the foundational gender and parent-child relations where children first experience, observe, and are taught what is considered normal and moral in human relations. By contrast, the social categories of the partnership system and the domination system focus particular attention on this foundational matter. And by so doing, they make it possible to see connections, interconnections, relationships, configurations that are otherwise invisible. For example, the connection between whether or not violence is considered normal in child rearing and whether a society is more warlike or peaceful, more inequitable or equitable. And I really want to emphasize that no society orients completely to either end of what I call the partnership domination continuum. However, the degree of orientation affects all institutions, beliefs, and relations, and with this, whether our human capacities for consciousness, empathy, caring, cooperation, and creativity, or our capacities for insensitivity, cruelty, exploitation, and destructiveness are socially supported or inhibited. And as I will briefly illustrate, it even affects brain development. Now, this is a basic tenet of my theory of bioculturalism, a theory that is evolving and is awaiting input from scholars from various disciplines, which combines what we are learning from neuroscience with findings from the study of relational dynamics. Now, bioculturalism starts from the premise that our species has a vast spectrum of behavioral capacities. Yes, we're genetically equipped for destructiveness and creativity, for cruelty and caring, for rote conformity and independence, for suppression of awareness and consciousness of ourselves, others, and our natural habitat. So, and what I'm proposing through this theory of bioculturalism is that while there are biological differences, of course, which of these capacities are either suppressed or inhibited largely hinges on cultural norms, which especially in their effect on child rearing styles, as well as family relations in general, have a major impact on the kinds of people we become. And I will start with some work that is probably familiar to you. The psychological literature on how the suppression of empathy and the deflection of pain and anger to, quote, inferior or, quote, dangerous outgroups is fostered in domination-oriented families. Now, this first, as some of you may know, gained attention through the work of Elsa Frankel-Brunswick on the authoritarian, highly prejudiced personality in trying to answer the question of how many people in a, quote, civilized nation like Germany could become Nazis and do what all that led to the horrors that it perpetuated. But this has also since then been documented by others. For instance, social psychologists Michael Milburn and Sherry Conrad document how people who had harsh childhoods are often drawn to political leaders who advocate a punitive social agenda, such as capital punishment, heavy investment in prisons instead of in caring for people, military force, punishment of, quote, immoral women and gays. And they also point out that this kind of politics is really a way of deflecting repressed pain and anger. And that it is actually, they found, especially pronounced in men who were severely punished as children, which Milburn, by the way, and Conrad attribute also to a male socialization that teaches boys and men to deny so-called soft feelings such as fear, pain, empathy, and to suppress empathy, and to focus instead on anger and contempt as the only properly masculine emotions. And of course, these kinds of dynamics also help explain why so many people have unquestioningly followed orders from their, quote, superiors, no matter how brutal these orders may be. Now, I want to add, of course, that there are and always have been those who reject all this. But adaptation to fear and force-based childhood experiences and learning to accept the, quote, traditional control of men over women tend to habituate people to accept, even idealize, authoritarian control and inequality, as well as the use of violence, be it in intimate or international relations. Moreover, as we are now learning from neuroscience, these stressful experiences affect the development of the brain. For instance, they tend to lead to high cortisol levels associated with impulsive violence, depression, use of drugs or alcohol for psychological escape, and so on. Now, I really want to emphasize that this does not mean that what we experience and observe as adults does not matter. Actually, we now know that our human brain continues to develop for a very long time after we're born, not only in the first few years. In fact, the prefrontal cortex, which plays such a critical role in human behavior, actually, we now know, does not fully develop until after puberty. Moreover, behaviors and values can and do change in adults, and experience and observations change. For example, we know that the effects of emotional damage in childhood, though they can usually not be completely erased, can be reduced by therapeutic interventions, by supportive and caring adult relations, etc. And of course, the choices people make also make a difference. Indeed, studies show that our choices of behaviors directly affect our brain neurochemistry. A striking and fascinating and directly relevant example to what we're talking about comes from studies showing that when fathers spend time with their children, their levels of testosterone drop. For example, a large study showed that those fathers who reported 3 hours or more of daily child care had lower testosterone compared with fathers not involved in care. And even more interesting is that fathers in a Tanzanian culture, where fathers are involved in parenting, had low testosterone, while fathers from a neighboring culture without active fathering did not. And equally interesting and directly relevant are studies showing that cultures where fathers play active, nurturing roles tend to be more peaceful and more egalitarian, of course, less male dominated, and have lower levels of stress. All of which takes us to yet another important difference between domination and partnership oriented cultures: levels of stress and the effect this has on brain neurochemistry. Now, the problem is that in domination-oriented culture, well, they're highly stressful starting in early childhood, with what we today know is their characteristic, highly punitive, coercive child-rearing styles. And what we know today is that persistent or traumatic stress decreases the levels of oxytocin and vasopressin, substances that, as many of you know, are involved in bonding and caring. They also decrease the turnover of neurotransmitters such as serotonin, that has a calming effect, of dopamine, which produces positive feelings, and instead brings into play hormones such as cortisol, norepinephrine, epinephrine, which are, as I said, associated with, well, fight or flight responses, especially violent and other negative behaviors. Now, in rigid domination environments where stress is high and chronic, typically starting in childhood with harsh and punitive child rearing, these kinds of neurochemical patterns often become habitual and are accompanied by denial, the deflection of pain and anger against outgroups, a propensity towards prejudice, violence, and other dysfunctional habits. Now, the good news is that we are today seeing a strong movement towards a very different kind of parenting. A movement that I want to emphasize is not happening in isolation, but in the context of the shift to a more partnership-oriented way of structuring all relations as at least the ideal norm. But before we look at this movement, I want to briefly sketch for you the partnership and domination social configurations so you have a better sense of these interactive dynamics. Now, if you look at some of the most brutally violent and repressive societies of modern terms, be it Hitler's Germany, a technologically advanced Western rightist society, Stalin's former Soviet Union, a secular leftist society, Idi Amin's Uganda, a tribalist society, Khomeini's Iran, the Taliban of Afghanistan, and more recently the so-called Islamic Caliphate or ISIL, Eastern religious societies, actually we see this domination configuration in sharp relief. Of course, viewed through the lenses of conventional social categories, these societies seem to have nothing in common, but they share the same interactive configuration of the following three core components. First, a structure of rigid top-down rankings in both the family and the state or tribe. Second, the ranking of the male half of humanity over the female half, and along with this gendered ranking, a system of gendered values in which traits, activities stereotypically associated with women or the quote feminine, such as caring, caregiving, nonviolence, are devalued, be it in women or men. Men are considered sissies, wimps, right? Or in business and social policy. The third, and these are all interactive, core component is culturally accepted abuse and even idealized violence and abuse, all the way from traditions of child and wife beating to pogroms, lynchings, public executions, chronic warfare. And I should add that every society has some abuse and violence. But in cultures or subcultures orienting closely to the domination side of the continuum, abuse and violence have to be institutionalized and even idealized. Well, if rigid hierarchies of domination are to be maintained, be it man over woman, man over man, race over race, religion over religion, caste over caste, class over class, tribe over tribe, nation over nation, and so on. Now, quickly moving to the core partnership configuration, it too consists of three interactive, mutually supporting components. The first is a democratic and egalitarian structure in both the family and the state. And I really want to emphasize that this does not mean there are no hierarchies, but they are what I have called hierarchies of actualization rather than hierarchies of domination. More flexible hierarchies where power, as we today read in the progressive management literature, is viewed as empowering rather than disempowering, and as we read in the progressive literature on parenting, is described as authoritative rather than authoritarian. Now, the second core component of partnership systems is equal partnership between, well, the two halves of humanity, women and men. And with this, a high valuing in both women and men of qualities and behaviors, such as nonviolence, nurturance, caregiving, which are, well, and this has been our heritage really from more rigid domination times, really devalued as soft, feminine, unmanly in domination systems. And the third component is that violence and abuse, while there is some, it's not culturally institutionalized or idealized. Why? Because they're not needed to maintain these rigid rankings of domination. Now, again, as with societies that orient to the domination end of the partnership domination continuum, societies that orient to the partnership end also transcend conventional categories. To briefly illustrate, in contrast to some domination-oriented tribal societies, where family violence is customary and may even include brutal rituals, such as female genital cutting, mutilation, etc., the forest hederae, as the University of California anthropologist Stuart Schlegel observed from his fieldwork, and I quote, have the core configuration characteristic of the partnership model. They are generally egalitarian, women and men have equal status, and they are peaceful, end of quote. Another example of orientation to the partnership side of the continuum is the agrarian Minangkabao, the fourth largest ethnic group in the Sumatran archipelago. Now, as among the Terurai, here women play major social roles. Violence is not part of Minangkabao child raising. Stereotypically feminine values such as caring and nurturing, as the University of Pennsylvania anthropologist Peggy Sandai writes, are valued in both women and men and are really part of social governance. On the other side of the globe, Nordic societies, such as Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Norway, also orient more closely to the partnership side of the continuum. Now, while these highly technologically advanced societies are not ideal, there is more democracy, again, in both the family and the state. Uh, and yes, there are no huge gaps there between haves and have-nots, as is characteristic of domination-oriented cultures and subcultures. Women have higher status. They hold high political offices. They're 40 to 50% of national legislatures. And because the status of women is higher, the status of the so-called feminine is also higher. So nurturance, caring, is supported by fiscal policy through measures such as universal health care, high quality child care, elder care with dignity, stipends to help families care for children, generous paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers, and other caring policies. In other words, these more partnership oriented societies tend to support the kinds of activities that lead to child flourishing in the sense described by Gleason and Narvis, of supporting activities that help children grow into people who are more caring and empathic, which these nations tend to be, as shown by, well, for example, their larger investment in caring for their own people, as well as their large investments, larger than most much wealthier nations, in NGOs that care for people on the other side of the globe. They also highly value cooperation, as shown by their many cooperative economic enterprises, and not coincidentally, because we're talking about interactive configurations, they're also in the forefront of the movement to leave behind the idealization of violence and domination. They have a strong men's movement to decouple so-called masculinity from its association with domination and violence. They pioneered peace studies programs. They pioneered the first laws against the use of physical discipline of children in families. So, yes, they have more of a partnership configuration. Moreover, and this, again, I think is very important for us to understand. If we look at the last several centuries through the analytical lens of this partnership domination continuum, we see that there has been strong movement towards the partnership side of the continuum as one progressive modern social movement after another has challenged entrenched traditions of domination. I mean, think about it. The 17th and 18th century European Enlightenment, quote, rights of man movement challenged the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule their, quote, subjects. The 18th and 19th century feminist and women's rights movements challenged the supposedly divinely ordained right of men to rule the women and children in the, quote, castles, a military image, of their homes. The 19th and 20th century abolitionists, civil rights, anti-colonial movements challenged another supposedly divinely ordained right, that of a, quote, superior race to rule over a supposedly, quote, inferior one. The movements against economic injustice challenged traditions of top-down economic rule and exploitation. The peace movement, more recently, and very importantly, the movement to end traditions of domination and violence against women and children in families, which is still a global pandemic, challenged using violence to impose one's will on others. And the environmental movement challenges the conquest and domination of nature, which at our level of technological development really poses some very severe threats to our species, doesn't it? However, and this is very important, this movement towards partnership has been countered by fierce resistance every inch of the way and has been punctuated by periodic regressions to the domination side of the continuum. So what we really see from this perspective is, well, we begin to see patterns in what otherwise seems random and disconnected. And this takes me really to one of the main tenets of the cultural transformation theory I introduced, that this tension underlies the whole span of human cultural evolution. Now, Cultural transformation theory, introduced in my book, The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, and developed in many books and articles, provides a new non-linear view of human cultural evolution. And to radically simplify, this theory traces our cultural evolution from prehistory to our time. It holds that most gathering hunting cultures oriented more, because it's always a matter of degree, to the partnership side of the continuum. And by the way, this is today also shown by studies some of you may be familiar with of contemporary gathering hunting societies. It also holds that, based on evidence from archaeology and myth, that this was the primary direction in most cultures well into the early Neolithic or farming age, and in a few places as late as the middle of the Bronze Age. And then, during a period of great disequilibrium brought by massive climate changes and other dislocations, there was a shift in the mainstream of cultural evolution with the imposition of rigid and brutal domination systems. And these have been the norm for much of recorded history, despite periodic movement, as I have documented in my work, in a partnership direction. And in more recent centuries, as I said, during another period of great disequilibrium brought by the gradual shift from the agrarian to the industrial and now post-industrial age, the partnership movement has gained momentum. However, and this is vital, until now, the primary focus of this movement has been dismantling the top of the domination pyramid, the so-called public sphere of economic and political relations that was once aptly called the quote men's work because women were excluded. Far, far less attention has been given to traditions of domination and violence in our most foundational formative relations, parent-child and woman-man relations in the so-called private sphere, relations that are to this day viewed by many people who consider themselves progressives as just women's and children's issues. By contrast, for those pushing us back to more rigid rankings of domination, whether Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, Khomeini's Iran, the Taliban, maintaining or reinstating family and gender relations based on domination and submission is the top priority. So it's not coincidental that today's so-called religious fundamentalists, who are actually domination fundamentalists, be they Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, or Christian, keep pushing for a return to the, quote, traditional family. It's really a code word for a family in which men dominate women and children learn never to question orders, no matter how painful or unjust. Nor is it coincidental that some religious fundamentalists here in the United States actually promote parenting guides that they call them parenting God's way. Of course, yeah, they tell parents to terrorize their children, to teach them that the parent's will is law, which is clearly a way of socializing people to submit to domination as adults and to suppress empathy. Now, all this is part of the regression to domination. At the same time, there is a mounting movement towards partnership, as I said, facilitated by the disequilibrium brought by radical technological change. First, the gradual shift from agrarian to the industrial era, now the rapid shift, and it's really rapid, from the industrial to the post-industrial knowledge service age. And these technological changes have brought a great deal of social and economic dislocation, but it is precisely this dislocation that has made possible massive changes in both consciousness and social organization in a partnership direction. So what we see is a point counterpoint. You can best image it as an upward spiral towards the partnership model, countered by enormous resistance and periodic regressions to the domination model. Now, the problem and it is a critical problem, is that we cannot afford to continue to have these regressions. We are getting signals from all sides that the mix of high technology and an ethos of domination could take us to an evolutionary dead end. In our time of nuclear and biological weaponry and the ever more destructive conquest of nature, you know, the once hallowed conquest of nature, the shift away from domination to partnership is more urgent than ever before. Nonetheless, as I have briefly sketched, this shift cannot succeed unless we construct the solid foundations on which more partnership-oriented societies can be built worldwide. So it's not only that children will not be able to reach their full human potentials unless we shift from domination to partnership in our primary gender and parent-child relations. Unless we do, we will not be able to meet our unprecedented environmental, economic, and social challenges. Without these foundations, we will continue to see the splitting of humanity into in-groups and out-groups, starting with the in-group of, quote, mankind and the female, quote, other, with women, by the way, not coincidentally, and this is shown by global statistics, including here in the United States, constituting the mass of the world's poor and the poorest of the poor worldwide. We will continue to see the high levels of stress that so severely limit our capacities to realistically assess problems and find and implement creative solutions. Yes, we'll continue to see high levels of violence, the use of violence to impose one person's, one nation's, one tribe's, one religion's will on others. We will continue to see the irresponsible exploitation and domination of both people and nature. Indeed, when people are taught early on, while their brains are being formed, to view dominating or being dominated as the only alternative, they tend to find it difficult, sometimes impossible, to see that there are more equitable, less stressful partnership options. Which is why your work on the conditions that promote child flourishing, especially the expression of our human capacities for consciousness, empathy, caring, cooperation, and creativity is so very important, not only for individual children and families, but for all our collective futures. Now, there's much more I would like to add, but I want to close by emphasizing the need for continuing exploration of the interaction between genes and experiences in the context of domination-oriented or partnership-oriented cultures as mediated by families, education, economics, and other social institutions. We need continuing research on how adaptation to fear and force-based childhood experiences and learning to accept the control and, quote, superiority of half of humanity over the other tend to habituate people to accept and even idealize authoritarian control, inequality, and yes, the use of violence and abuse to enforce these, be it in families or the family of nations. We need continuing research on how different kinds of families and cultural environments contribute to child flourishing, that is, to the expression of our capacities for consciousness, empathy, caring, cooperation, and creativity. The Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, a new peer-reviewed online journal housed at the University of Minnesota, is being launched in November to make this kind of research available and to provide a new vehicle to both scholars and practitioners for sharing their work. And you can find out about this online at Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies. And I invite you to use this new journal to access scholarly work on the cultural transformation to partnership, as well as to submit your relevant work. As Kurt Lewin, the founder of social psychology, said, research can and must play a part in building a better society. not an ideal society or utopia, which literally means no place, but what I have called a pragmatopia, a possible place. A place where relations, beginning with our foundational childhood and gender relations, are structured so that every child can realize her or his highest potential. And we can all, through our research and writing, help lay the foundations for building this more peaceful and equitable place. I thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Question. Thank you, thank you. That was brilliant. We appreciate your taking the time to be with us. Do we have questions? We have microphones here.
Yes, I wish I could see you.
Yes, I'm sorry about that.
Don't worry about it. I'll manage.
Okay. I have one question for you. You sort of alluded to it, and whether the United States, which direction do you think it is going? Partnership or domination?
Well, it's going in both, isn't it?
Yes.
It's going we're very much in a regression to the domination side, have been for several decades, actually. But at the same time, there is forward movement towards partnership. But as I said, one of the major problems is that the people who are working, for human rights, for social justice, for the environment, for economic equality, et cetera, they are not giving enough attention to the foundations on which a more partnership-oriented system can rest. And so we keep having regressions because the domination system keeps rebuilding itself in different forms, whether it was a totalitarian regime in Nazi Germany or in Soviet Union, whether it's a religious regime. It just keeps coming back because, as you all know so very well, we're not addressing how people's brains are being directly affected by their early childhood experiences. And therefore, we have to. This is why this research that you are doing, Narcia, and so many others are doing here, is so important. We have to really, from a larger social perspective, pay much, much more attention to laying these foundations so that we no longer see people who think of themselves as, quote, progressives saying, oh, yeah, well, we'll get to these issues once we've addressed the more, quote, important ones. Well, these are important. In fact, they are critical.
One of the dominating forces in our world today are the economists and the business leaders who shape the way we think by the kinds of things they pressure us to buy and provide for us. And I was wondering if you could say more about your Partnership for a Caring Economy or that aspect.
Yes, I'd be delighted to do that. To again quote Kurt Lewin, who spoke about action research, not in the contemporary sense of involving people, which he also did, but in the sense of leading to action, leading to positive action to make ours a better place, right? What he really has pointed out is that if we don't put our research into action, then it's nice. We can have nice academic debates about it, right? So the Center for Partnership Studies was founded, it was founded because after The Chalice and the Blade, which, by the way, is 925 foreign editions, was published, people kept writing saying, well, okay, we want to do something. So we formed a not-for-profit called the Center for Partnership Studies. And as you said, it's based on what are the interventions? What are the critical interventions with a cascade of systemic effects? And one of these interventions, to make a long story short here, is changing the economic thinking, but with it also the economic measurements and as the basis for changing economic rules of the game, practices, and policies. So if you go to caringeconomy.org, which is the website of the Caring Economy campaign, one of our main messages is that we must, first of all, have what we call social wealth economic indicators. GDP really is a very, very lousy measure. I mean, I won't even go into that. That would be another discussion, another 1 hour discussion. But even most alternative economic indicators don't take into account what you all know is so vital, the value, and including the economic value of the work of caring and caregiving starting in early childhood, not only for human development, but for human capacity development, for that high quality human capital that economists, they keep telling us it's essential for the knowledge service, post-industrial age, but at the same time, they pay no attention, or hardly any attention, to the fact that we are the only nation that does not have paid parental leave, that we're the only nation, nationally subsidized sick leave, paid parental leave, that doesn't subsidize for children at risk. Families simply do not have the capacity, economic or in terms of their education, to give children that start a high quality early childhood education. So, and yes, to really, when I said that women are the mass of the world's poor and the poorest of the poor, which, is a statistic well known and totally ignored by most economists. In the United States, women over the age of 65 are twice as likely to live in poverty as men of the same age. And the reason is not just job discrimination, it's because most of these women are or were either full or part-time caregivers, and poverty is their reward. In short, the Caring Economy campaign is also about really effectively addressing seemingly intractable problems such as the disproportionate poverty of women, children, communities of color. The low wages for direct care work are ridiculous. And from every aspect, including not only a human aspect, but also in terms of just, I'm giving you too much here. I'm going to stop. Because I'm sure that, I hope that I haven't left everybody speechless, because I know I've shared a lot of probably rather unfamiliar information with people who may not have heard of my work. But I hope there are some more questions or comments.
Well, I think people have a lot to think about, and you have given us a wonderful outline of what you have done for many years in more depth. And we thank you so much for your heartfelt leadership in these areas, and we pray for your continued well-being so that you can keep leading us.
Well, thank you. I've been sitting on ice, and I really am much better, which I wouldn't be if I had taken a 10-hour each-way flight with 2 airplanes and 2 limos to come and see you. And I probably wouldn't have gotten there because I was flying through Chicago. Yeah. But I'm so sorry that I can't be with you. I'm looking forward very much to seeing the other presentations.
Yes.
So anyway, I'm happy I could at least, as I said, be with you very briefly electronically. And thank you, Dorothea, for making that possible.
Well, thank you so much again, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good night.